These are the most tragic events ever caught on live television in the form of an iceberg. We will start with the least disturbing, but as we move down the iceberg, the events will get more intense, and this honestly has some of the most horrific events in human history. So viewer discretion is advised, especially near the bottom. But for now, let's start with the tip of the iceberg. January 6, 2021 began as a chilly winter morning in Washington, D.C. The sun had not yet risen when crowds of people from all corners of the country started gathering near the ellipse, just south of the White House. By 11 a.m., the crowd had swelled significantly, energized and vocal as they awaited the arrival of President Donald Trump. At noon, Trump took the stage to deliver a speech. He repeated unsubstantiated claims of a stolen election and urged his supporters to fight like hell and take back our country. At approximately 12:15 p.m., the crowd began to move towards the U.S. Capitol, where a joint session of Congress was set to certify the results of the Electoral College. By 12:30 p.m., tensions were rising outside the Capitol. Demonstrators were climbing barriers and confronting law enforcement. As the crowd grew larger and more aggressive, it became clear that this was no ordinary protest. Around 1 p.m., the crowd reached the Capitol's west side. Chanting and waving flags, they overwhelmed the initial barriers and began to clash with Capitol Police. Moments later, the mob breached the outside perimeter, and chaos ensued. At 1:10 p.m., the first skirmishes between protesters and police turned violent. Pepper spray and tear gas were deployed, but the crowd pressed on, determined to breach the Capitol. At 1:30 p.m., the situation escalated further as rioters smashed windows and forced their way into the Capitol building. The sound of breaking glass and alarms echoed through the halls as the mob flooded inside. Meanwhile, at the center of the Capitol, lawmakers were in session, conducting the ceremonial process of certifying the Electoral College votes. And as the rioters breached the building, the session was abruptly halted. By 2 p.m., the rioters had spread throughout the Capitol. They entered the Senate chamber, rifled through documents, and took photos. Throughout the building, rioters were seen in offices, including that of Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi. At 2:30 p.m., Vice President Mike Pence was evacuated to a secure location. Lawmakers and staff were also rushed to safety, taking cover in secure rooms and offices. At 3 p.m., the National Guard was mobilized, and additional law enforcement agencies were called to restore order. However, it would be hours before the Capitol was secured. By 3:30 p.m., rioters had been photographed and recorded vandalizing offices, looting, and engaging in violent confrontations with the police. These chaotic scenes were broadcast live on television and streamed online, shocking viewers around the world. At 4 p.m., President Trump released a video message on social media, repeating his claims about the election but also telling the rioters to go home in peace. But this message did little to stop the violence. By 6 p.m., a curfew was in effect in Washington, D.C., and law enforcement began to slowly regain control of the Capitol, where the last of the rioters were cleared from the building and the process of securing the area commenced. June 17, 1994, dawned as an ordinary summer day in Los Angeles, but by evening, it would become one of the most unforgettable days in American television history. Earlier that week on June 12th, Nicole Brown Simpson, the ex-wife of former football star O.J. Simpson, and her friend Ronald Goldman were found brutally murdered outside Nicole's home in Brentwood, Los Angeles. The shocking double homicide sent ripples through the community and captivated the nation. In the days following the murders, suspicion quickly fell on O.J. Simpson, where on June 17, 1994, Simpson was scheduled to surrender to the police by 11 a.m. However, when he failed to appear, a manhunt was launched. At around 2 p.m., the Los Angeles Police Department held a press conference officially declaring O.J. Simpson a fugitive. The media frenzy soon intensified as the search for the former football star began. By 5 p.m., police discovered that Simpson was traveling in a white Ford Bronco driven by his friend and former teammate. And the Bronco had been spotted heading south on Interstate 405, and a pursuit ensued. At approximately 6 p.m., the iconic chase began. News helicopters captured live footage as the Bronco, with Simpson reportedly in the backseat holding a gun to his head, cruised down the freeway at around 35 miles per hour. The spectacle unfolded on live television, preempting regular programming across the nation. Throughout the chase, thousands of people lined the overpasses and roadsides holding up signs for support of Simpson. The public, glued to their televisions, watched in real time as the drama unfolded. Meanwhile, police cars trailed the Bronco, maintaining a cautious distance to avoid provoking Simpson. As the chase continued, O.J. Simpson's attorney, Robert Shapiro, and the LAPD detective Tom Lang spoke to Simpson by cell phone, urging him to surrender peacefully. Tensions were high, and the outcome remained uncertain. At 7:57 p.m., the Bronco exited the freeway and headed towards Simpson's home in Brentwood, where news helicopters followed closely, capturing every moment. At approximately 8 p.m., the Bronco pulled into the driveway of Simpson's estate. There, a standoff ensued as police and negotiators worked to get Simpson out of the vehicle, all while crowds gathered outside the property and the media broadcast the live scene. After nearly an hour of negotiations, at around 9 p.m., Simpson finally emerged from the Bronco. He was immediately taken into custody without incident. In the vehicle, police found a gun, a passport, a disguise kit, and a substantial amount of cash, suggesting that Simpson had been preparing to flee the country. June 4, 2004 was a clear and ordinary day in the small town of Granby, Colorado. But for one man, Marvin Heemeyer, this day marked the culmination of years of anger and frustration. Marvin Heemeyer, a skilled welder and muffler repair shop owner, had been embroiled in a bitter dispute with local officials and neighbors over zoning issues. Feeling wrong and unheard, Heemeyer decided it was time to take matters into his own hands. In secret, Heemeyer had spent months meticulously modifying a Komatsu D355A bulldozer in his shop. He reinforced it with layers of steel and concrete, creating an almost impenetrable armored vehicle. Inside, he installed cameras and monitors to navigate, turning the bulldozer into a formidable machine of destruction. He called it the Killdozer. At approximately 2 p.m., Heemeyer set his plan into motion. Emerging from his workshop, he climbed into the Killdozer and began his rampage. His first target was the concrete plant that had been the source of many of his grievances. With the roar of its engines and the screech of metal and concrete, the Killdozer plowed through the walls of the plant, leaving a path of destruction in its wake. Onlookers watched in shock and disbelief as the armored behemoth continued in its relentless assault. But the Granby Town Hall was the next target. The fortified bulldozer smashed through the building, reducing it to rubble. Emergency service were called, but the Killdozer's thick armor rendered it impervious to small firearms and even explosives. At 3 p.m., the local newspaper office and the home of the former mayor were next on the list. Both buildings were heavily damaged, with the Killdozer showing no signs of slowing down. As panic spread through Granby, law enforcement agencies including the local police, sheriff deputies, and even SWAT teams scrambled to find a way to stop Heemeyer. All attempts to disable the vehicle were failing, as the heavily fortified Killdozer continued its destructive path. By 3:30 p.m., the rampage extended to the Grambles hardware store and several other businesses. Heemeyer seemed to have a precise list of targets, all of which were associated with his previous grievances. At 4 p.m., Heemeyer steered the Killdozer towards the local library and a new concrete batch plant, causing significant damage to both structures. The town of Granby was in chaos, with residents fleeing and authorities desperately trying to regain control. At 3:30 p.m., after more than 2 hours of destruction, the Killdozer finally came to a stop. While attempting to demolish another building, the bulldozer became stuck in the foundation, immobilizing the vehicle. As law enforcement surrounded the disabled Killdozer, they heard a single gunshot from inside. This was the end of the rampage. August 30th, 1997 was an evening filled with glitz and glamour for Diana, Princess of Wales. She had spent the evening in Paris, dining at the Ritz Hotel with her companion. The couple, hounded by paparazzi, sought a brief escape from the public eye. At around 12:20 a.m., Diana and her companion left the Ritz Hotel, hoping to reach a nearby apartment. To evade the paparazzi, they took a different route, using a decoy car at the front entrance while they slipped out the back in a Mercedes-Benz S280. Henry Paul, the deputy head of security at the Ritz, was at the wheel. Sitting beside him was bodyguard Trevor Rees-Jones, while Diana and her partner settled in the back. But when they departed, they were pursued relentlessly by paparazzi on motorbikes. At approximately 12:20 a.m., the Mercedes entered the Pont Tunnel. The high-speed chase turned deadly, as the car traveling at an estimated 65 miles per hour lost control and collided with a pillar in the tunnel. The impact was devastating. Within minutes, the first responders arrived at the scene. Paparazzi who had been following the car were also there, capturing the horrific aftermath. At 12:32 a.m., Princess Diana's partner and Henry Paul were pronounced dead at the scene. Trevor Rees-Jones, despite severe injuries, was conscious and survived the crash. Diana, however, was in critical condition. By 1 a.m., she was rushed to a nearby hospital. All the while, news of the accident began to spread and the world held its breath. At 2 a.m., surgeons at the hospital performed emergency surgery, working tirelessly to save the princess. But despite their best efforts, her injuries were too severe. At 4 a.m., the doctors made a heart-wrenching announcement. Diana, Princess of Wales, had succumbed to her injuries. She was pronounced dead at the age of 36. January 28th, 1986, began as a day of great anticipation and excitement for NASA and the United States. The Space Shuttle Challenger, carrying 7 astronauts, among them Christian McAuliffe, a teacher who had become the first civilian in space, was scheduled to launch from the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. At 11:38 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, the countdown clock at the Kennedy Space Center reached 0, and the Space Shuttle Challenger lifted off from Launch Complex 39B. This launch had been delayed multiple times due to weather and technical issues, but it was now finally underway. Challenger's rocket boosters ignited, propelling the shuttle into the clear blue sky. The roar of the engines could be heard for miles as the shuttle ascended, trailing a plume of smoke. 30 seconds after liftoff, the shuttle was traveling at approximately 200 feet per second. Inside the orbiter, the crew performed their duties, unaware of the impending catastrophe. 36 seconds after liftoff, Mission Control in Houston, Texas instructed the crew to go at throttle up, a command to increase engine power for the next phase of flight. 58 seconds after liftoff, the first signs of trouble appeared as a plume of gray smoke was visible, indicating a potential issue with one of the joints on the booster. 1 minute and 10 seconds after liftoff, the flame from the leak grew as hot gases began to escape the right booster, damaging the external fuel tank. 5 seconds later, the shuttle was subjected to aerodynamic forces that reached max Q, point of maximum dynamic pressure. This compromised the rocket booster, and the external tank couldn't withstand these forces. At 11:39 a.m., 1 minute and 21 seconds after liftoff, the shuttle exploded in a massive fireball at 46,000 feet. The orbiter carrying the crew was torn apart by aerodynamic forces, where the explosion was seen on live TV by millions of viewers. Debris from the Challenger began to fall into the Atlantic Ocean, where the crew compartment also fell from the sky, plummeting into the ocean below. Back in Houston, the control room was filled with confusion and disbelief. Efforts were made to communicate with the crew, but no response came. The control room went into a state of emergency. News networks began to broadcast the devastating footage, and the world watched in shock and horror. And it was at this point the loss of Challenger and its crew became apparent. June 14th, 2017 began like any other day in North Kensington, London, but in the early hours of the morning, tragedy struck that would forever change the community and ignite a national outcry. At approximately 12:54 a.m., a fire started on the 4th floor of the Grenfell Tower, a 24-story residential building. The fire quickly spread, fueled by the building's exterior cladding, which was later found to be highly flammable. Residents were awakened by smoke and flames, with many being trapped inside their apartments, while the fire alarm system failed to operate effectively since there was no central fire alarm system in the building. By 1 a.m., emergency services were flooded with 911 calls. Firefighters from across London rushed to the scene, but they faced significant challenges in battling the blaze and rescuing residents. The fire spread rapidly up the exterior of the building, engulfing the entire structure within hours. The cladding, installed during a recent renovation, contributed to the rapid vertical spread of the flames. Throughout the early morning hours, scenes of the horror unfolded. Residents trapped inside the Grenfell Tower communicated with loved ones and emergency services via the phone, desperate for help. At 5:17 a.m., the building's upper floors began to collapse. The fire had destroyed the structural integrity of the tower, forcing firefighters to retreat from the building. By mid-morning, Grenfell Tower was a smoldering ruin. The devastating toll of the fire became clear. 72 people lost their lives, and dozens more were injured. This was the deadliest fire in the United Kingdom since World War II. August 4th, 2020 was a day like any other in Beirut, Lebanon. The bustling port city was alive with activity as residents went about their daily routines, but little did they know that their lives were about to be changed forever. At 6 p.m. Eastern European summertime, a fire was reported in Warehouse 12 at the port of Beirut. This warehouse was situated in the heart of the port area, close to densely populated neighborhoods and commercial districts. At 6:08 p.m., first responders, including firefighters and port workers, rushed to the scene to contain the blaze. But unknown to them, the warehouse also contained approximately 2,750 tons of ammonium nitrate, a highly explosive material that had been stored there for 6 years. At 6:09 p.m., the first explosion occurred, sending a shockwave through the port and surrounding areas. This explosion was significant, but it was merely a precursor to what was about to come. Just moments later, a massive second explosion erupted, triggered by the ignition of the ammonium nitrate. This blast sent a towering mushroom cloud into the sky, accompanied by a deafening boom that could be heard up to 150 miles away. The force of the explosion was equivalent to a 3.3 magnitude earthquake, registering on all seismographs across the region. As the shockwave radiated outwards, it flattened buildings, shattered windows, and overturned cars within a wide radius. The impact was catastrophic. The immediate blast zone was devastated, the port area bearing the brunt of the destruction. Buildings as far as 6 miles away suffered significant damage, leaving countless people injured and homeless. At 6:15 p.m., rescue operations began, with firefighters, paramedics, and volunteers working tirelessly to pull survivors from the rubble. The scale of the devastation was immense, and the search for the victims continued throughout the night and into the following days. Following the explosion, the death toll continued to rise as more bodies were recovered. Over 200 people were killed and more than 6,000 were injured, with hundreds of thousands of residents being displaced from their homes. March 11th, 2011 started as a typical day in Japan. The country, known for its preparedness and resilience, was about to face one of the most devastating natural disasters in human history. At 2:46 p.m. local time, a powerful earthquake struck off the northeast coast of Honshu, Japan's main island. The magnitude 9.0 quake was one of the strongest ever recorded. The ground shook violently for nearly 6 minutes, causing widespread damage. By 3 p.m., the immediate aftermath of the earthquake was apparent. Buildings had collapsed, fires had broken out, and infrastructure was severely damaged. But the disaster was far from over. At 3:15 p.m., Japan issued a tsunami warning. The quake had triggered a massive tsunami, and the waves were racing towards the coast, where residents in coastal areas were forced to evacuate. But the tsunami arrived with terrifying speed and force. At 3:27 p.m., the first wave struck the coast. In some areas, the tsunami reached heights of up to 40 meters. The sheer power of the water obliterated everything in its path. Entire towns and villages were swept away, leaving behind scenes of unimaginable destruction. By 4 p.m., the scale of destruction was becoming clear. The waves had traveled several kilometers inland, engulfing homes, schools, and businesses. Thousands of people were missing, and many were trapped in the wreckage. To make matters worse, at 4:36, reports emerged of a potential nuclear crisis. The Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant, located on the coast, had been severely affected by the earthquake and tsunami. The plant's cooling systems had failed, leading to fears of a nuclear meltdown. The next day, the situation at the plant worsened. An explosion occurred in one of the reactors, releasing radioactive material into the atmosphere. And by March 13, 2011, the full extent of the devastation was becoming apparent. The death toll was rising rapidly. Thousands were confirmed dead and many were missing. The tsunami had left over 500,000 people homeless. Shelters were overflowing, and to make matters worse, there was now a nuclear crisis. By March 16, 2011, the nuclear crisis at Fukushima continued to escalate. What started with a single reactor explosion resulted in several of the reactors experiencing partial meltdowns. Workers at the plant, known as the Fukushima 50, bravely battled to contain the situation, risking their lives to prevent further catastrophe. And in the end, the official death toll had surpassed 15,000 people, with over 2,500 still missing. And the economic cost of this disaster was estimated to be over $235 billion, making it one of the costliest natural disasters in human history. August 23, 2005 marked the beginning of a storm that would become one of the most devastating natural disasters in US history. In the warm waters of the Bahamas, a tropical depression formed, soon strengthening into Tropical Storm Katrina. By August 25, 2005, Katrina made landfall in Florida as a Category 1 hurricane, causing flooding and power outages, but this was just the beginning. On August 27th, Katrina had become a Category 3 hurricane, where the National Hurricane Center issued warnings for the Gulf Coast, predicting catastrophic damage. New Orleans, a city below sea level and protected by a system of levees, was in the crosshairs. On August 28th, Katrina reached Category 5, with winds exceeding 175 miles per hour. Evacuation orders were immediately issued for New Orleans, but it was too late. Soon after making landfall, the storm surge overwhelmed the levee system, leading to catastrophic flooding in New Orleans. Within hours, 80% of the city was underwater. Thousands of residents who had not yet evacuated sought refuge in attics and on rooftops waiting for rescue. The Superdome, designated as a shelter of last resort, became a symbol of the unfolding crisis. Over 10,000 people packed into the facility during sweltering heat, unsanitary conditions, and a shortage of food and water. By August 31st, the humanitarian crisis deepened. Reports of looting, violence, and desperation emerged from the city. And it wasn't until days later on September 2nd when the arrival of federal aid finally arrived. In the months that followed, the full impact of Hurricane Katrina came into focus. Over 1,800 lives were lost and millions were affected, with the economic cost being staggering, with damage estimates exceeding over $125 billion. January 12, 2010 began as an ordinary day for the people of Haiti, but beneath the surface, tectonic forces were building towards a catastrophic event. At 4:53 p.m. local time, the ground beneath Haiti began to shake violently. A powerful 7.0 magnitude earthquake struck, approximately 25 kilometers west of the capital, Port-au-Prince. The initial tremor lasted about 35 seconds, but its impact was devastating. Buildings crumbled, road cracks opened, and infrastructure collapsed. The densely populated city of Port-au-Prince was hit hardest, with countless homes, schools, and hospitals reduced to rubble. By 5 p.m., the full extent of the disaster began to unfold. The presidential palace, the National Assembly building, and the main jail were heavily damaged. The United Nations Stabilization Mission in Haiti headquarters collapsed, killing men. As dusk fell, the cries of those trapped under debris filled the air. Survivors, disoriented and terrified, poured into the streets. The city was plunged into darkness as electricity failed, and communication networks were severely disrupted. Throughout the night, aftershocks continued to rock the region, adding to the fear and the chaos. Rescue efforts immediately began, but the sheer scale of the destruction made it an almost impossible task. With many roads being blocked or impassable, reaching those in need was a monumental challenge. On the morning of January 13th, the full extent of the devastation was clear. Entire neighborhoods were flattened, and makeshift camps sprang up in open areas as people sought safety and shelter. Hospitals, many of which were damaged or destroyed, were flooded with the injured. By January 18th, the focus began to shift from rescue to recovery. The death toll was staggering. Estimates indicated that over 200,000 people had lost their lives, and many more were injured or missing. December 26, 2004 started as a serene day across the Indian Ocean. Little did anyone know that it would become one of the deadliest natural disasters in recorded history. At 7:58 a.m. local time, a massive undersea earthquake struck off the west coast of northern Sumatra, Indonesia. Measuring a staggering 9.1 to 9.3, was one of the strongest ever recorded. This earthquake's powerful tremors lasted between 8 and 10 minutes, triggering a series of devastating tsunamis across the Indian Ocean basin. Within minutes, coastal communities in Indonesia, Thailand, Sri Lanka, India, and several other countries were engulfed by towering waves, with the tsunami's initial impact being swift and catastrophic. By 8 a.m., entire villages and towns were obliterated within moments. The force of the water swept away buildings, cars, and people, leaving behind scenes of unimaginable destruction. Within hours, the tsunami's waves had spread across the Indian Ocean, with resorts, hotels, and other coastal communities being devastated, with thousands of tourists and locals caught off guard. As the tsunami's waves traveled further, they reached the coastlines of Somalia, Kenya, and even as far as the Maldives, with the scale of this disaster being unprecedented, with millions of people affected across multiple countries. By midday on December 26th, the full extent of the devastation became apparent. Thousands were confirmed dead and many more were missing. Survivors were left homeless, traumatized, and in urgent need of assistance. And in the end, mass burials became necessary, as the death toll had crossed over 220,000 people. November 22nd, 1963 began as a day of anticipation and excitement in Dallas, Texas. President John F. Kennedy and First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy were visiting the city as a part of a political tour ahead of the upcoming 1964 presidential election. At 12:30 p.m. Central Standard Time, President Kennedy's motorcade entered Dealey Plaza. The president's open-top limousine carrying him, the First Lady, Texas Governor John Connally, and his wife Nellie Connally proceeded along Elm Street. Moments later, shots rang out. President Kennedy was struck by 2 bullets, one in the upper back and another fatal shot to the head, with Governor Connally also being wounded in the attack. Chaos erupted as the motorcade sped towards Parkland Memorial Hospital, desperately trying to save the president's life. At 1 p.m., President Kennedy was pronounced dead by the attending physicians. The news shocked the nation and the world. Within hours of the assassination, Lee Harvey Oswald, a former Marine and defector to the Soviet Union, was arrested for the murder of President Kennedy. As Oswald was being transferred from police headquarters to the county jail, he was fatally shot by Jack Ruby, a nightclub owner with connections to organized crime. The shooting was broadcast live on television, further shocking the nation. June 5th, 1968 was a pivotal day in American history, marked by the tragedy and the abrupt end of hope. Senator Robert F. Kennedy, younger brother of President John F. Kennedy, had just achieved a significant victory in the Dallas Democratic presidential primary. At approximately 12:15 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, Senator Kennedy addressed his supporters at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles. He spoke of unity, progress, and the promise of a better future. As Kennedy left the stage, he was escorted through the kitchen pantry area en route to a press conference. And moments later, shots rang out. Kennedy was struck by multiple bullets, fatally wounded. Chaos erupted as the crowd and security personnel reacted to the gunfire. Kennedy's assailant was identified as a 24-year-old Palestinian immigrant. Saran was immediately apprehended at the scene. Senator Kennedy was rushed to a nearby hospital, where doctors fought to save his life, but despite their best efforts, he succumbed to his injuries. This assassination sent shockwaves across the nation. And later, Saran, the assassin, was convicted of first-degree murder in 1969 and sentenced to life in prison. April 19, 1995 started as an ordinary day in downtown Oklahoma City. But at 9:02 a.m. Central Daylight Time, tragedy struck with a devastating act of domestic. A powerful explosion ripped through Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building, a 9-story office complex housing numerous federal agencies, including a daycare. The force of the explosion caused a large section of the building's north face to collapse, trapping people inside and burying victims under rubble. First responders, including firefighters, police officers, and emergency medical teams, rushed to the scene within minutes. But their heroic efforts were hampered by the scale of the destruction and the need to secure the unstable structure. It claimed the lives of 168 people, including 19 children in the daycare center. Hundreds more were injured, many critically. Within hours, law enforcement began investigating the cause of the explosion. Evidence quickly pointed to a rental truck parked outside the building which had been packed with explosives. Investigators identified Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols as the primary perpetrators of the both were linked to extremist militia movements and anti-government sentiments. Timothy McVeigh, a Gulf War veteran, was arrested shortly after the driving without a license plate. He was later charged, tried, and convicted on federal murder and charges. Terry Nichols was also arrested and eventually convicted on charges related to his role in the conspiracy. In 1997, McVeigh was sentenced to death and executed by lethal injection in 2001, while Nichols received multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole. April 15, 2013 was Patriots' Day in Massachusetts, a day for celebration and athletic achievement marked by the annual Boston Marathon. This event, which draws runners and spectators from around the world, began under clear skies and high spirits. At approximately 2:49 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, as runners were crossing the finish line on Boston Street, 2 explosions ripped through the crowd. Placed near the finish line detonated within seconds of each other. The first explosion occurred on the north side, near the finish line, followed by a second explosion about 210 yards west. These blasts created scenes of chaos and devastation. 3 people were killed and over 260 others were injured, many critically, with some even losing limbs. The FBI quickly took charge of the investigation, treating the as an act of terrorism. Authorities released surveillance photos and videos of the 2 suspects on April 18th, appealing to the public for help in identifying them. That night, the suspects, later identified as Tamerlan and Sahar Tsarnaev, killed MIT police officer Sean Collier in a failed attempt to steal his gun. The brothers then carjacked a vehicle and engaged in a shootout with police in the suburb of Watertown. One of the brothers was killed in the exchange, while the other managed to escape, prompting a massive manhunt. But 4 days later, on April 19th, he was discovered hiding in a boat in a residential backyard and was apprehended after a brief standoff. The capture of the surviving brother brought relief to the city and marked the end of a tense and traumatic week, where he was later convicted on multiple charges and sentenced to death in 2015. October 1st, 2017 was a night of music and celebration on the Las Vegas Strip. Thousands of country music fans gathered for the final night of Route 91 Harvest Festival, an annual outdoor concert held across from the Mandalay Bay Resort and Casino. At 10:05 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time, the festival atmosphere was shattered by the sound of rapid thunder. Concertgoers initially mistook the shots for fireworks, but the horrific reality soon became clear. A had opened fire from the 32nd building of the hotel, targeting the crowd below. Later identified as 64-year-old Stephen Paddock, had meticulously planned his attack over several days. He had transported a cache of firearms and ammunition into his hotel suite, breaking the windows to create sniper positions. For 10 terrifying minutes, Paddock unleashed a barrage of bullets onto the concertgoers. The first 911 call was made at 10:08 p.m., and police officers quickly responded to the scene, initially unsure of the shooter's location. As the gunfire continued, chaos ensued. Thousands of people tried to flee, seeking cover wherever they could find it, while concert staff and bystanders helped the injured and directed people to safety. At 10:16 p.m., the gunfire ceased. Paddock had fired over 1,000 rounds, killing 58 people and injuring more than 850 others, making it the deadliest mass shooting in modern US history. By 10:17 p.m., officers had located the room on the 32nd floor of the hotel. Using a master key, they breached the door, and inside they found Paddock already dead. The Munich Olympics of 1972 were intended to be a celebration of peace and unity, marking the first time the games were held in Germany since the 1936 Berlin Olympics. But the spirit of goodwill was shattered on September 5, 1972. In the early hours of that morning, around 4:30 a.m., 8 members of the Palestinian group of Black September infiltrated the Olympic Village. Disguised as athletes, they climbed over the fence and made their way to the building housing the Israeli team. At approximately 4:35 a.m., the forced their way into the Israeli quarters, immediately taking coach Moshe Weinberg and wrestler Yosef Romano hostage. Weinberg attempted to fight back but was shot and killed, where Romano also tried to overpower the attackers but was fatally wounded. The then rounded up 9 more Israeli athletes and demanded the release of 234 Palestinian prisoners held in Israeli jails, along with 2 German in German custody. German authorities, caught off guard, began delicate negotiations with the terrorists as the world watched in horror as the situation unfolded live on television. As negotiations dragged on throughout the day, the terrorists insisted on being flown along with their hostages to Cairo. German officials reluctantly agreed to a plan involving a helicopter transfer to a nearby airbase. At around 10 p.m., the hostages and terrorists were transported by bus to 2 waiting helicopters. They were flown to a nearby airbase where German police had planned an ambush. The plan, however, was poorly executed. The snipers were improperly trained and in the wrong position. At 11:30 p.m., a firefight erupted between the terrorists and the German police. The firefight lasted until shortly after midnight on September 6th, ending in a tragic and chaotic manner. One of the terrorists threw a grenade into one of the helicopters, killing all of the hostages inside. The other hostages in the second helicopter were shot and killed by the terrorists. In total, 11 Israeli athletes and coaches were killed. 5 of the 8 were killed during the firefight. The remaining 3 were captured by the German authorities. November 18th, 1978 remains one of the darkest days in modern history, marked by the horrific events at Jonestown in Guyana. The People's Temple, led by the charismatic and controversial Reverend Jim Jones, had established a commune in the remote jungles of South America. The story of Jonestown began in the mid-1950s, when Jim Jones founded the People's Temple in Indianapolis, Indiana. The church, which promoted racial integration and social justice, attracted a diverse and dedicated following. However, allegations of abuse and financial misconduct began to surface, leading Jones to relocate his congregation to California in the 1960s and eventually to Guyana in 1977. By 78, Jonestown was home to over 900 members of the People's Temple who had relocated there in search of a utopian society. However, reports of human rights abuses and people held against their will began to emerge, drawing the attention of concerned relatives and the US government. On November 14, 1978, US Congressman Leo Ryan traveled to Guyana to investigate these reports. Accompanying him were journalists and concerned relatives of the Jonestown residents, where they initially received a warm welcome from Jim Jones and his followers. However, tensions quickly escalated. During the visit, several residents expressed a desire to leave with the delegation. On November 18th, as Ryan and his entourage prepared to depart from a nearby airstrip, they were ambushed by armed members of the People's Temple. At approximately 5:20 p.m., Congressman Ryan, 3 journalists, and 1 defector were shot and killed. Several others were injured but managed to escape into the jungle. Back in Jonestown, Jim Jones, realizing the impending collapse of his commune, called his followers to the Central Pavilion. In a chilling speech, Jones convinced his followers that the only way to escape from the impending prosecution was to commit a horrific act. Large vats of cyanide-laced drinks were prepared, and the poison was distributed to the members. Parents were instructed to administer the poison to their children first. As night fell, over 900 people, including more than 300 children, perished. The next day, the Guyanese military arrived at Jones, discovering the horrific scene. The images of the bodies, many holding hands, shocked the world and brought a tragic end to the People's Temple. September 1st, 2004 began a day of celebration in the town of Beslan, Russia. It was the first day of the new school year, a time for joy and excitement for students, parents, and teachers at school number 1. At approximately 9 a.m., as the opening ceremony was underway, the unthinkable happened. A group of heavily armed terrorists, later identified as Chechen militants and English fighters, stormed the school. Gunfire erupted as the attackers forced over 1,100 hostages, including children, parents, and teachers, into the school building. The attackers herded the hostages into the school gymnasium, where they rigged the room with explosives and mines. Terrified, the hostages were forced to sit in sweltering heat with no food or water. The militants issued demands, calling for the withdrawal of Russian troops from Chechnya and the release of imprisoned fighters. By 10 a.m., local authorities and emergency services had surrounded the school. As the news of the siege had spread, families of the hostages gathered outside, desperate for information about their loved ones. Throughout the day, negotiations between the militants and Russian officials were tense and sporadic. The captors threatened to kill hostages if their demands were not met, and sporadic gunfire and explosions could be heard from inside of the school. September 2, 2004 marked the second day of the siege. Conditions inside the gymnasium were deteriorating rapidly. The hostages, especially the children, were becoming increasingly dehydrated and weak. Around 1 p.m., a powerful explosion detonated inside the gymnasium, likely set off by one of the explosive devices. This triggered a massive firefight between the militants and Russian security forces. Amid the chaos, hostages began to flee. Many were caught in the crossfire, while others helped carry the injured to safety. Russian special forces, alongside local volunteers, launched a full-scale assault on the school to rescue the remaining hostages. By 3 p.m., large parts of the school were engulfed in flame, adding to the horror of the scene. The sound of gunfire, explosions, and the cries of the wounded filled the air. By late afternoon, the siege was over. Russian forces had secured the school, but the aftermath was devastating. Over 330 people, including 186 children, lost their lives in the siege. 100 more were injured, many critically. April 20th, 1999 began like any other school day at Columbine High School in Littleton, Colorado. Students and teachers were engaged in their regular routines, unaware that their lives were about to be changed forever. At approximately 10:10 a.m., seniors Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold arrived separately at the school. Each was armed with multiple firearms, homemade, and a detonation to cause mass destruction. Harris and Klebold entered the school grounds from the parking lot, where they planted 2 duffel bags containing propane in the cafeteria. These were set to detonate at 11:17 a.m. Soon after, the gunmen began their attack, opening fire outside the west entrance of the school. Rachel Scott and Richard Castaldo were the first victims, while sitting on the grass. The gunmen then moved toward the west entrance, where they continued their firing randomly as they entered the building. At 11:24 a.m., Harris and Klebold made their way to the library, where they committed the most intense and of the attack. For the next 7 minutes, they used the students hiding under the desks and tables, killing 10 and injuring 12. The gunmen then left the library at 11:36 a.m., wandering the school hall and setting off explosives with little effect. They eventually returned to the cafeteria, where they attempted unsuccessfully to detonate the propane. By 12:08 p.m., Harris and Klebold returned to the library, where they bringing the massacre to a close. In total, 12 students and 1 teacher were killed, while there were over 20 others who were injured. December 14th, 2012 began as a typical Friday morning in Newtown, Connecticut. The children and staff at Sandy Hook Elementary School started their day with their usual routines, unaware of the impending tragedy. At 9:30 a.m., Adam Lanza, a 20-year-old man from Newtown, arrived at Sandy Hook Elementary School. Before arriving at the school, Lanza had fatally shot his mother, Nancy Lanza, at their home. At 9:35 a.m., Lanza approached the entrance of Sandy Hook and shot his way through the glass window next to the locked front doors. The sound of gunfire alerted Principal Don Hoshburn, school psychologist Mary Sherlock, and lead teacher Natalie Hammond, who immediately ran towards the source of the noise. Immediately, the 3 confronted Lanza, and he opened, killing Hoshburn and Sherlock instantly. Hammond was injured, but managed to crawl to safety and call 911. Minutes later, Lanza entered the main office, but the staff had already taken cover. He then proceeded down the hallway toward the first grade classrooms. Lanza entered classroom 8, where substitute teacher Lauren Rousseau was in charge. He opened fire. Lanza then moved to classroom 10, where teacher Victoria Sato had been hiding her children in a closet and the bathroom. Sato attempted to shield the children and confronted Lanza, telling him the children were in the gym. But unfortunately, this didn't work. Minutes later, officers arrived at Sandy Hook Elementary and began securing the perimeter and preparing to enter the building. They could hear gunshots from inside, but they didn't know the exact location of the shooter. Meanwhile, Lanza was continuing his rampage, moving through the school and firing indiscriminately. He briefly entered the hallway again, through a window and hitting a police cruiser outside. At 9:48 a.m., as police entered the school, Lanza retreated into a classroom. Realizing that the authorities were closing in, at 9:50 a.m., officers found the body and confirmed that the shooter was down. And by 10 a.m., the school was finally secured. Valentine's Day 2018 started as a normal school day at Majority Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida. The students and staff went about their routines, unaware that tragedy was about to strike. At 2:19 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, former student Nicholas Cruz, carrying a case and a backpack filled with ammunition, arrived at the school in an Uber. He was dropped off near the campus just before the end of the school day. At 2:21 p.m., Cruz entered Building 12, also known as the Freshman Building, through the east stairwell. Immediately, he began firing into rooms on the first floor. Cruz then pulled the fire alarm, causing confusion and panic among students and staff who were unaware if it was a drill or a real emergency. At 2:23 p.m., Cruz continued his rampage, moving systematically from room to room on the first floor. He shot through windows of locked classroom doors, targeting students and teachers who were trying to hide or protect others. By 2:24, the first 911 calls were made, and local law enforcement and emergency services were immediately dispatched to the scene. During this time, Cruz moved to the second floor of the building. By now, many of the students had realized the gravity of the situation and were taking shelter inside of classrooms and closets, barricading doors and trying to stay silent. The scene was chaotic, with smoke from the gunfire adding to the confusion. At 2:28 p.m., Cruz stopped shooting and discarded his rifle and tactical vest. Blending in with the fleeing students, he exited the building and walked towards the school's tennis courts. At 2:29 p.m., law enforcement officers arrived on campus, securing the perimeter and beginning the process of clearing buildings and searching for the shooter. SWAT teams and additional emergency personnel were also called in to assist, but they were unable to locate Cruz. During this time, he had left the school grounds and walked to a nearby Walmart where he purchased a drink at Subway inside the store. He then proceeded to a McDonald's inside for a brief period. Meanwhile, the SWAT team had cleared Building 12, and they discovered the full extent of the carnage. Students and staff who had survived were evacuated and treated for their injuries, but the shooter could not be found. Immediately, a frantic search had begun. By 3:41 p.m., Nicholas Cruz was apprehended without incident by a police officer in a residential area approximately 2 miles from the school, and after being identified by a witness, he was taken into custody. September 11th, 2001 began as a clear, sunny Tuesday morning across the eastern United States. But as the day unfolded, it would become one of the darkest days in American history. At 5:45 a.m., hijackers Muhammad Atta and Abdulaziz Al-Omari passed through security at Portland International Jetport in Maine, boarding a flight to Boston Logan International Airport. By 6 a.m., flights began departing from airports across the country as usual. The hijackers were preparing to board 4 specific flights that would soon change the world. At 7:59 a.m., American Airlines Flight 11, a Boeing 767, took off from Boston Logan International Airport bound for Los Angeles. On board, there were 92 people, including 5 hijackers. At 8:14 a.m., United Airlines Flight 175, another Boeing 767, took off from Boston Logan International Airport, also headed to Los Angeles. This flight carried 65 people, including 5 more hijackers. At 8:20 a.m., American Airlines Flight 77, a Boeing 757, departed Washington Dulles International Airport en route to Los Angeles with 64 people on board and 5 more hijackers. And finally, at 8:42 a.m., United Airlines Flight 93, a Boeing 757, left Newark International Airport bound for San Francisco. It carried 44 people, including 4 more hijackers. At 8:46 a.m., it was a beautiful day in New York City. But moments later, American Airlines Flight 11 crashed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center between floors 93 and 99. Immediately, the impact had killed everybody on board and hundreds inside of the building, igniting a massive fire. At 8:50 a.m., President Bush was visiting an elementary school in Sarasota, Florida, where he was informed of the first crash, but initial reports suggested that it was only a tragic accident. At 9:03 a.m., United Airlines Flight 175 struck the South Tower of the World Trade Center, hitting between floors 77 and 85. The explosion and the fireball confirmed that America was now under attack. At 9:05 a.m., Chief of Staff Andrew Card whispered to President Bush, "A second plane hit the second tower. America is under attack." But Bush remained in the classroom for several minutes before addressing the nation. At 9:28 a.m., hijackers took control of United Airlines Flight 93 over Ohio. Passengers and crew, aware of the earlier attacks through phone calls, began planning a counterattack to regain control of the plane. Meanwhile, at 9:37 a.m., American Airlines Flight 77 crashed into the Pentagon in Arlington, Virginia, killing 59 aboard and 125 military and civilian personnel inside of the building. But the explosion also caused a partial collapse of the structure. By 9:42 a.m., the Federal Aviation Administration grounded all flights across the United States, marking the first time in U.S. history that air traffic nationwide was halted. At 9:59 a.m., after burning for 56 minutes, the South Tower of the World Trade Center collapsed in just 10 seconds, sending a massive cloud of dust and debris through the streets of Lower Manhattan. Back on United Airlines Flight 93, at 10:03 a.m., it crashed into a field in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, after passengers heroically attempted to overpower the hijackers. Their actions prevented the plane from reaching its intended target, believed to be either the White House or the US Capitol. 20 minutes later, at 10:28 a.m., the North Tower of the World Trade Center collapsed after burning for 102 minutes, where the collapse had caused widespread devastation and loss of life. By 12:30 p.m., rescue workers and volunteers began a massive search and rescue operation amidst the rubble and debris at Ground Zero. But the scale of the destruction had made the task monumental and dangerous. In the end, approximately 3,000 people had died, including the 19 hijackers, and over 6,000 people were injured in the World Trade Center attacks. And following these events, the world was never the same. Now, if you made it this far, you have successfully seen the entire iceberg. So please consider subscribing and let us know what kind of iceberg you would want to see next.